In late March of 2016, nearly 100 farmers gathered at a farm equipment auction outside Dodge City, Kansas. The auction had been scheduled after a local farmer named Walter Simmons decided to retire. For more than 40 years, Walter had farmed nearly 1,900 acres of wheat and corn across the flat fields west of town. When he finally decided to step away from farming, he listed most of his equipment for auction. By mid-morning, trucks and trailers filled the dirt road leading to the farm. Farmers walked slowly through the lineup of machines. Some carried notebooks. Others ran their hands across tire treads, checking wear. Engines were opened. Hoods were lifted. People leaned inside tractor cabs studying gauges and hour meters. Near the front of the row stood the machines most people had come to see. A John Deere 8335R, Case H Magnum 280, a late model combine. Those machines drew the largest crowds. Farmers circled them carefully, calculating resale values and repair costs in their heads. But far away from that crowd, at the very end of the auction row, sat a tractor almost nobody bothered to inspect. It looked rough. The paint had faded almost completely. Large patches of rust covered the hood. The left fender had been bent years earlier and never repaired. The cab windows were dusty and scratched. One of the headlights was missing entirely. The tractor looked so worn that several farmers walking past it simply laughed. A small paper sign had been taped to the steering wheel. It read, 1974 International Harvester 1066. As is. Most people didn't stop walking. Machines like that could hide expensive problems. Old tractors sometimes needed new clutches, transmission work, engine rebuilds, hydraulic pumps. Repairs like that could cost more than the tractor itself. So when farmers reached the end of the row and saw the rusted International 1066, most simply kept moving toward the trucks parked along the fence. But one man stopped. His name was Daniel Harper. Daniel was 54 years old. He farmed about 850 acres nearly 25 miles south of Dodge City. Unlike many farmers at the auction that day, Daniel wasn't looking for the newest equipment. He had always preferred older machines. Machines he could repair himself. Daniel walked slowly around the rusted tractor. He didn't say much. But he studied the machine carefully. He checked the rear axle housing. He wiped dust from the engine block with his hand. He crouched down beside the drawbar and looked underneath the tractor. Two farmers standing nearby noticed him inspecting the machine. One of them laughed. "You thinking about buying that pile of rust?" Daniel shrugged. "Maybe." The farmer shook his head. "You'd be better off buying scrap metal." Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he climbed up onto the step and leaned inside the cab. The hour meter read just under 6,400 hours. For a tractor built in the mid-1970s, that number was surprisingly low. Daniel looked back at the engine again. Something about it caught his attention. But he didn't say what it was. By noon, the auctioneer climbed onto a flatbed trailer that served as the bidding platform. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "All right, folks," the auctioneer said. "Let's get started." The bidding began with smaller equipment. Old wagons, fuel tanks, tool chests. Then the tractors began rolling forward one by one. The modern machines sold quickly. Bidding moved fast. Some tractors brought prices over $100,000. But as the afternoon went on, the crowd slowly began thinning. Farmers loaded purchased machines onto trailers. Others started driving home. Eventually the auction reached the very last tractor. The rusted International Harvester 1066. The engine started after several seconds of cranking. A cloud of dark smoke drifted out of the exhaust pipe. The tractor rattled loudly as it idled beside the auction trailer. The auctioneer looked down at the remaining crowd and smiled. "Well, folks," he said, Looks like we saved the rustiest one for last. Several people laughed. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That thing even run." The auctioneer chuckled. "Well, it got here somehow." He lifted the microphone again. "All right. Who'll start me at $2,000? The crowd stayed silent. The auctioneer waited a few seconds. 1,500. Still nothing. A few farmers turned and began walking back toward their trucks. The auctioneer lowered the price again. 1,000. The tractor continued rattling loudly beside him. No hands went up. Finally the auctioneer sighed and tried again. "All right. Who'll give me $500? For a moment nobody moved. Then a single hand slowly rose near the back of the crowd. It was Daniel Harper. Several people turned to look at him. One man laughed out loud. "You serious?" Daniel nodded calmly. The auctioneer pointed toward him. 500 I've got." He scanned the crowd. "Anybody want to go 600? Silence. The auctioneer raised the microphone again. "Going once. Going twice." Then the hammer struck the podium. "Sold." The rustiest tractor at the auction had just sold for $500. And most of the crowd believed Daniel Harper had just made a very expensive mistake. But there was one thing hidden beneath the hood of that tractor. Something almost everyone at the auction had completely missed. And within a few weeks, that rusted machine would surprise nearly everyone who had laughed that afternoon. Daniel Harper didn't rush to load the tractor onto his trailer. Most of the auction crowd had already begun leaving by the time the rusted International Harvester 1066 was officially sold. Trailers rumbled down the dirt road carrying newer tractors and combines that had sold for far larger prices. But the old 1066 still sat beside the edge of the wheat field where the auction had taken place. Daniel stood beside it quietly for a few minutes. A couple of farmers walking past him shook their heads. One of them laughed again. $500, the man said. "I hope you like fixing tractors." Daniel simply nodded. "Sometimes that's half the fun." The farmer smiled sarcastically and climbed into his pickup truck. Within minutes the dust from departing vehicles began drifting across the field. The auction was over. Daniel climbed up onto the step of the old tractor and turned the key again. The starter motor groaned for a moment. Then the diesel engine caught. The machine rattled loudly as it settled into a rough idle. The sound wasn't unusual. Older tractors often ran that way. But Daniel noticed something else. The turbocharger gave a short whistle when he touched the throttle. That sound was what had caught his attention earlier. Most farmers walking through the auction had focused on the rust and faded paint. But Daniel had been looking at the engine. And when he wiped the dust from the turbo housing earlier that morning, he had seen something unusual. A larger aftermarket turbocharger. The kind normally installed on tractors prepared for heavier pulling or modified field work. Daniel eased the tractor slowly toward the loading ramps of his trailer. The clutch pedal felt worn. The steering had some play in it. But the engine responded smoothly when he pressed the throttle. That was a good sign. He drove the tractor carefully up the ramps and chained it down. Then he began the 25-mile drive back to his farm. By the time he arrived home, the sun was already lowering behind the flat Kansas horizon. Daniel backed the trailer into the yard beside a small metal workshop behind his house. The shop wasn't large. Just a simple building with concrete floors and tool cabinets along the walls. But Daniel had rebuilt several tractors inside that building over the years. He unloaded the 1066 and drove it slowly inside. Under the bright lights of the workshop, the tractor looked even rougher than it had at the auction. Rust spread across the hood. Dust covered the engine block. The cab interior smelled of old grease and dry leather. But Daniel wasn't looking at the paint. He shut off the engine and opened the side panels. The large diesel engine sat beneath the hood. a 436 cubic inch International Harvester engine, one of the strongest tractor engines built during the 1970s. Daniel wiped more dirt away from the turbocharger housing. The stamping on the metal became clearer. It confirmed what he had suspected earlier. The turbocharger was not the original factory unit. Someone had installed a larger performance turbo. He leaned closer and inspected the fuel injection pump. Another detail caught his eye. The adjustment screws had been modified. That meant the engine had likely been tuned for more power. Daniel leaned back and smiled slightly, because that explained the sound he had heard when the tractor started earlier. Someone in the past had spent time improving that engine. Most people walking through the auction that morning had only seen rust. But Daniel had seen something different. Potential. He climbed back into the cab and started the tractor again. The diesel roared to life. Daniel pushed the throttle forward gently. The turbocharger whined louder as the engine speed increased. For a moment, the old tractor sounded far more powerful than it looked. Daniel let the engine settle back to idle and shut it down. He stepped back and looked at the machine again. The paint was still faded. The body still looked rough. But beneath the hood, that tractor might be capable of producing far more power than anyone at the auction had expected. Daniel walked into the house later that evening and sat down at the kitchen table. His wife glanced up from the sink. "So," she asked, "did you buy anything today?" Daniel nodded. "A tractor." She dried her hands on a towel. "How much?" Daniel poured himself a glass of water. $500. She stared at him for a moment. 500. Daniel smiled. "Yeah." She shook her head. "I hope it runs." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Oh, it runs." What he didn't say yet was that the rustiest tractor at that auction might turn out to be the strongest machine he had bought in years. And before long, other farmers in the county would begin noticing it too. For the next several days, the old International Harvester 1066 stayed inside Daniel Harper's workshop. Spring field work was approaching quickly, and Daniel still had plenty of other tasks to finish around the farm. But each evening after the day's work was done, he returned to the shop and spent a little more time studying the tractor. The machine had clearly worked hard during its life. Dust filled the corners of the cab. Oil stains covered parts of the engine block. The seat cushion had cracked from years of sun. But the engine itself looked surprisingly solid. Daniel started with the basics. He drained the old oil, replaced the filters, checked the fuel lines. Old tractors often failed because of small things that had been ignored over time. Within a few hours, he had already replaced 2 worn hoses and cleaned the air intake system. None of the parts were expensive. By the end of the first evening, he had spent less than $100 bringing the tractor back into decent condition. The next afternoon he decided it was time to see what the machine could actually do. Behind his barn sat an old grain wagon that still held several hundred bushels of wheat from the previous harvest. Normally Daniel used one of his larger tractors to move wagons that heavy. But this time he backed the rusted 1066 up to the hitch. From the outside, the combination didn't look impressive. The faded paint, the worn tires. Anyone driving past the farm might have assumed the tractor would struggle. Daniel climbed into the cab and started the engine. The diesel rumbled loudly under the metal roof of the shop. He eased the tractor forward and connected the drawbar. Then he slowly released the clutch. The wagon began moving across the yard without hesitation. Daniel drove toward the dirt road that ran along the edge of his property. The loaded wagon rattled behind him as he shifted into a higher gear. The engine didn't strain. The turbocharger whistled softly as the tractor gained speed. By the time he reached the end of the road, Daniel was certain of something. That tractor had far more power than its appearance suggested. Later that afternoon, Daniel's neighbor Calvin Reed pulled into the driveway. Calvin had heard about the auction earlier in the week. As soon as he stepped out of his pickup, he noticed the old tractor parked beside the barn. "That the $500 tractor you bought?" Calvin asked. Daniel nodded. "That's the one." Calvin walked slowly around the machine, studying the rusted hood and faded paint. "You planning to rebuild it?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "Maybe." Calvin laughed. "You might spend more fixing it than it's worth." Daniel climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The diesel roared to life again. He eased the tractor forward and pulled the loaded wagon across the yard. Calvin watched quietly as the wagon rolled behind the tractor. After a moment, his expression changed. "Well, I'll be," he said. "That thing pulls better than it looks." Daniel parked the tractor and shut off the engine. Calvin shook his head. "Maybe you found yourself a deal." Daniel smiled slightly. "Maybe." Over the next few days, word about the old tractor began spreading around the county. At the grain elevator, the feed store, and at the small cafe in town where farmers gathered early each morning, people talked about the auction. About the farmer who bought the Rustiest tractor for $500. At first, most people assumed Daniel had simply gotten lucky. But as more farmers began hearing about how the tractor performed, curiosity started growing. Because if the stories were true, the rusted machine that everyone had laughed at during the auction might actually be something very different. And before long, Daniel Harper would decide to test that idea somewhere everyone could see it. Over the next few weeks, the old International Harvester 1066 became a regular part of Daniel Harper's daily work around the farm. Most of the jobs he gave it were simple: pulling wagons, hauling seed, moving equipment around the yard. But every time he used the tractor, the same thing kept happening. The machine performed far better than anyone expected. The engine pulled harder than most tractors its age. The turbo responded quickly when the throttle moved forward. And even under heavier loads, the tractor never seemed to struggle. Daniel noticed it most during early spring field work. One afternoon he hooked the tractor to an old disc harrow that he normally pulled with a larger machine. The field behind his farm stretched across nearly 40 acres of dry Kansas soil. Daniel lowered the disc blades into the dirt and pushed the throttle forward. The old tractor rolled steadily across the field. The engine settled into a deep, powerful rumble. Soil rolled behind the disc as the blades cut through the ground. Even in the tougher sections of soil, the tractor didn't slow down. By the time Daniel finished the first pass across the field, he was certain of something. That engine was producing far more power than a standard 1066 should. A few days later, his neighbor Calvin Reed stopped by again. Calvin leaned against the fence watching the tractor work. "You know," Calvin said after a moment, "they're holding the tractor pull at the county fair next month." Daniel shut down the engine and stepped out of the cab. "I heard about it," he said. The tractor pull was part of the annual Dodge City County Fair. Every summer farmers from across the area brought tractors to compete in pulling contests. Some tractors were older farm machines. Others had been heavily modified for competition. Calvin nodded toward the old 1066. "You ever think about entering that thing?" Daniel laughed. "That tractor's not built for competitions." Calvin shrugged. "Maybe not. But it sure pulls stronger than it looks." Daniel wiped a layer of dust from the rusted hood and looked at the tractor for a moment. From the outside, the machine still looked rough. The faded paint, the dented fender, cracked seat. Nothing about it suggested anything special. But Daniel had spent enough hours working around the engine to know something was different. Someone in the past had clearly modified the tractor. The larger turbocharger, the adjusted fuel system. Those changes weren't meant for ordinary farm work. Those were the kinds of upgrades people made when they wanted more power. Calvin smiled. "You paid $500 for it," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" Daniel chuckled. That's a fair point. Over the next week, the idea stayed in the back of Daniel's mind. Not because he expected to win anything, but because the tractor had already surprised him once. Maybe it could surprise a few other people too. A few days before the county fair, Daniel made a few small adjustments to the tractor. He replaced the worn rear tires with a better pair he had stored behind the barn. He tightened several bolts along the drawbar frame. And he checked the fuel system again to make sure the engine was running clean. Nothing complicated, just basic preparation. When the day of the fair arrived, Daniel drove the old tractor slowly down the road toward town. The diesel engine echoed across the open Kansas fields as the tractor rolled toward the fairgrounds. By the time he reached the entrance gate, dozens of tractors had already gathered near the pulling track. Some were shiny and freshly painted. Others had oversized rear tires built for traction. Most of them looked far more impressive than Daniel's old rusted machine. A few farmers standing near the track noticed him arrive. One of them laughed quietly when he saw the tractor. "That thing looks like it came straight out of a junkyard." Another farmer smiled. "Hope it makes it to the starting line." Daniel parked the tractor near the edge of the field and climbed down. He didn't respond to the comments. Instead, he walked toward the registration table and wrote his name on the entry sheet. The man running the event looked toward the rusted tractor and raised his eyebrows. "You planning to compete with that?" Daniel nodded. "Why not?" The official shrugged and handed him a number tag. "All right." Daniel walked back to the tractor and waited near the track as the first competitors began their pulls. One by one, the tractors moved forward. The heavy sled dragged behind them across the dirt. Some machines made strong runs. Others struggled halfway down the track. Daniel watched quietly from the side of the arena. Eventually, the announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Next competitor." There was a brief pause as he looked down at the entry sheet. Daniel Harper. Daniel climbed into the cab of the rusted International 1066 and started the engine. The diesel roared loudly as he drove slowly toward the starting line. Many people in the crowd began watching. Because the tractor rolling onto the track looked like the weakest machine of the entire day. And most of them expected the run to end quickly. But Daniel already knew something they didn't. The pulling track at the Dodge City County Fairgrounds stretched nearly 300 feet across the packed dirt arena. At the far end stood the distance marker that every competitor hoped to reach. Beside the starting line waited the pulling sled. A massive steel machine designed to grow heavier with every foot it moved. At the beginning of each run, most of the sled's weight rested on large rear wheels. But as the tractor pulled forward, a metal weight box slowly slid toward the front of the sled. The farther the tractor traveled, the more weight pressed into the dirt. Eventually the resistance became so heavy that even the strongest tractors could no longer move it. That was the challenge of tractor pulling. Not just power, but endurance. Daniel Harper guided the old International Harvester 1066 slowly toward the starting line. The rusted tractor rattled loudly as it idled beside the sled. A track official stepped forward and attached the heavy chain from the sled to the tractor's drawbar. Another official leaned up toward the cab window. "Keep it straight," he said. "Full pull is 300 feet. Daniel nodded. He had watched several tractors compete earlier that afternoon. Some of the newer machines had made impressive runs. One bright red Case IH Magnum had reached almost 280 feet. Another modified tractor had stopped just past 290 feet. So far, no one had reached the full distance. Daniel looked down the length of the track. A large crowd had gathered behind the fence. Many of them had come to the county fair every summer for years. They had seen hundreds of tractors compete on that same track. But the rusted 1066 sitting at the starting line looked nothing like the machines that normally won competitions. Several people in the crowd laughed quietly. One man folded his arms. That tractor won't even make it halfway. Another farmer chuckled. $500 tractor. 500 feet might be asking too much. The announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers. Next competitor on the track. Daniel Harper from south of Dodge City. Pulling with a 1974 International Harvester 1066. Daniel pushed the throttle forward. The diesel engine roared louder. The turbocharger gave a sharp whistle. The official raised a green flag. Daniel slowly released the clutch. For a moment the tractor barely moved. The heavy sled resisted the first pull. Then the rear tires dug into the dirt. The tractor began rolling forward. The sled slid slowly across the track behind it. The engine settled into a deep rumble. 50 feet, 70 feet, 100 feet. The sled's weight box began sliding forward. The resistance grew heavier. Several tractors earlier that afternoon had already started struggling at that distance. But the old 1066 kept moving. Daniel held the throttle steady. The turbo whistled louder as the engine worked harder. 150 feet. 200 feet. The crowd began growing quiet. A few farmers leaned forward against the fence. The tractor wasn't slowing down. 230 feet. 250 feet. Dust sprayed behind the rear tires as they fought for traction. The sled groaned as the weight box slid farther forward. But the engine never faltered. 270 feet. 280 feet. Now nearly everyone in the arena was watching. Even the competitors waiting with their tractors turned to look. The rusted machine kept pulling. 290 feet. The engine roared louder. The turbo screamed as the tractor clawed forward through the dirt. Then the front wheels rolled past the final marker. 300 feet. The sled finally ground to a stop just beyond the line. For a moment the entire fairgrounds fell silent. The rustiest tractor at the auction. The machine people had laughed at only weeks earlier. Had just pulled farther than every other tractor that day. The announcer leaned down toward the measurement marker. Then his voice returned through the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, that's a full pull." The crowd erupted into applause. Several farmers near the fence shook their heads in disbelief. One man laughed. "Well, I'll be." Daniel eased the tractor forward a few feet and shut down the engine. Officials unhooked the sled. As Daniel climbed down from the cab, Calvin Reed was already walking toward him. Calvin looked at the tractor and smiled. $500, he said. That might be the best deal in Kansas. Daniel brushed the dust from his hands and smiled. Maybe. But the story of the rustiest tractor at the auction wasn't finished yet. Because everyone who had watched that run was about to start telling the story. By the time the tractor pull ended that evening, the story of Daniel Harper's old International Harvester 1066 had already begun spreading across the fairgrounds. Farmers stood in small groups near the fence, still talking about the run they had just seen. The rusted tractor that had rolled onto the track looking like scrap. The machine that most people believed wouldn't make it halfway. And the moment when it pulled the sled past the 300-foot marker while newer tractors had already stopped. Many of the farmers there had attended the Dodge City County Fair for years. They had watched hundreds of tractors compete on that same dirt track. But very few of them had ever seen something quite like that. Because the machine that made the full pull wasn't the newest tractor. It wasn't the most expensive. It wasn't even close. It was the tractor that had sold for $500 at the auction just a few weeks earlier. As the sun slowly dropped behind the fairgrounds, several farmers walked over to look at the old 1066 more closely. One man leaned down beside the engine housing. Another farmer looked at the turbocharger. Someone asked Daniel where he had found the tractor. "At a farm auction outside town," Daniel said. "How much did you pay for it?" Daniel smiled slightly. $500. The farmer stared at him for a moment before shaking his head. "Well, I guess we should have looked at that tractor a little closer." Nearby, Calvin Reed laughed. "Looks like everybody else was too busy looking at the paint." Daniel wiped a little dust from the rusted hood and looked at the machine. The tractor hadn't changed. The faded paint was still there. The dented fender was still bent. The seat was still cracked from years of sun. But the way people looked at that tractor now was completely different. Because earlier that day, it had proven something in front of an entire crowd. Sometimes the value of a machine isn't obvious. Sometimes the best equipment is the one everyone walks past. The tractor that had once been the rustiest machine at the auction had just become the strongest tractor on the track. As the crowd slowly began leaving the fairgrounds, Daniel climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The diesel roared to life again. He drove the tractor slowly down the dirt road leading away from town. The sound of the engine echoed across the quiet Kansas fields. For Daniel Harper, the tractor everyone had laughed at had already earned its place on the farm. And the story of that $500 tractor would likely be told in coffee shops and grain elevators across the county for years to come. 'Cause sometimes, the machine nobody wants turns out to be the one that surprises everyone. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and become part of our growing YouTube family. We share real farm stories just like this one. Stories about tractors, auctions, farmers, and the unexpected moments that happen out in the countryside. And if you've ever found an incredible deal at a farm auction, or owned a machine that surprised everyone, tell us about it in the comments. We'd love to hear your story too.